Welcome, everybody. I'm Philip Reiner. I am the Chief Executive Officer of the Institute for Security and Technology. Thank you for joining us for this conversation here today, which is what I have earnestly put forward over the past couple of years, really one of the most critical sets of issues that we all could be thinking about when it comes to security and technology. And today we're extremely pleased to have the opportunity to engage with Dr. Herb Lin, who's coming to us from both CSAC and Hoover at Stanford, who has recently put forward this book, Cyber Threats and Nuclear Weapons, and really looking forward to engaging in a conversation today with you, Herb, to talk a little bit more about what you've discovered. Welcome. As always, it's great to engage with you on these sorts of issues. I think, for my intents and purposes, going through the book, one of the things that I wanted to point to first, which I thought was highly illustrative of the kind of challenges that we're dealing with here, right, was in chapter 4, you made note of, and let me actually even quote it here, that a fail-fast mindset is unacceptable in nuclear operations, right? And quote, agile DevOps should be avoided at all costs. Now, I think and we can talk a little bit about this from who you've been speaking with and folks that I know that we've been speaking with. What I'm afraid of is that's actually the direction we're headed, where you have an inclination in the system when it comes to modernization efforts, when it comes to the force of the future, that this fail-fast mindset coming from industry is something that needs to be adopted. That agile DevOps are necessary for a responsive NC3 system. And so wanted to kind of kick things off by saying, tell us about the book, tell us about the warning bell that in many ways that you're trying to sound here, kicking it off, with those, I think those two factors right there really encapsulate it really well.
Okay, so thank you. I'm really glad to be here. Just so this is an effort that came out of, that originated in an effort to try to look at the entire cyber landscape across the entire nuclear weapons enterprise. That is, from building the weapons all the way down to using them, and every step in between. Command and control, of course, is a big deal in that. That's where most of the literature is gone, but it's of course much more than just that. And your comment about fail-fast mindsets not being acceptable and avoiding DevOps and so on is is not per se command and control. It has to do with how you build software to do all of this stuff, not just in command and control, but in controlling weapon systems and planning and all this other stuff. So let's talk about that a little bit. To their credit, senior decision makers in Washington, like the head of Stratcom, have said that you want to do fail fast in the experimental stage when you're proofing out technologies. So I quote, I think I quote Admiral Richards in saying that. So he is not advocating fail fast in deployed technology. Okay, I mean, the idea that you would fail fast in deployed technology controlling nuclear weapons, that's nuts. And I know nobody within the system that believes that. Nevertheless, with that said, if you think about what does Silicon Valley do? Silicon Valley has pioneered the development of DevOps, and they do believe in fail fast, and they do believe in fail fast in deployed systems. Now, why does this work in the Silicon Valley environment? And you get some good software. You get software that meets user demands very, very well out of that. That's how you build DoorDash and Uber and Amazon and so on. Yep. And they have a chance to try to try stuff often. And if it doesn't work, they take it out and so on. They do a great job of building software, but nobody would assert that Silicon Valley software on DoorDash and Uber and so on is robust against cyber attack. Yeah. Nobody would say that. And the reason here is that the stuff works is that they have Silicon Valley companies that are, they're all in the business of trying to make money. That's what they should be doing. They have a clearly defined metric. Do people use their software? Can they use it to order product? Can they use it to order services? There's a well-defined metric, and people keep track of those metrics. Okay? So, and what it is that, the user rules. The user gets what the user wants. So then you ask, and the user is you and me when we're calling for a car. Okay, so that's a well-defined problem. But a nuclear command and control system is very different than that. That is, there are multiple users to it. There's a guy that's in the airplane flying, and there's his commander officer, and there's his commander's commander, and then there's the president of the United States and the Secretary of Defense, and so on. All of these people are users of the nuclear command and control system, for example. All of these people are users. And so let me give you an example. You could imagine a pilot carrying a weapon. Maybe it's nuclear, maybe it's not, but you could imagine a pilot carrying a weapon, and he sees a target, and he wants to go destroy the target. Can he or can she just go to that, go and destroy it on his own, on the pilot's own initiative, or should the pilot get approval? Well, from the pilot's standpoint, the necessity to get approval is a pain in the ass, right? Doesn't want to have to do that. Delay, the target may get out of range, may no longer be accessible, attackable, may lose the target, all those sorts of things. So for the pilot, speed is of the essence. But wait a minute. Let's say there's something sensitive about the target or something sensitive about the weapon, like it would be if it were new. What happens then? Should you get approval from the standpoint of a senior commander? You better believe it. I want this pilot to get approval. So I think that nobody would, if the decision is just affects the pilot, that's fine. You can use DevOps for that. So and fail fast. So it's which you do A/B testing and so on. And is this kind of display better than that kind of display for the pilot? Sure, you can make that argument, and that's fine. But when it comes to questions of who should have approval before a person can go to can drop a weapon, no, I don't want the pilot deciding that. I mean, to me, that's something that you want the commanders, the senior commanders and senior policymakers to be deciding. And this is an inherent tension. You can't you want that kind of top-down control in a military, especially in a nuclear environment. You don't want that kind of control, top-down control in a commercial IT setting like Uber.
So one of the things that I think is most valuable in terms of contributions to the overall literature and to the understanding of this nexus of these issues, right, is the fact that you weave a picture of how all of these things are interconnected, though, right? So you can bifurcate it out in terms of those users, right? But when you think about weapons design upgrades that need to be made to delivery vehicles, the tactical warning and attack assessment systems, NC3 more broadly, modernization efforts that are underway, when you think about the elements that potentially could be vulnerable at that level of the pilot versus the entire system, I think what you've done here is really incredibly helpful because it paints a picture of how, well, that COTS system or that software set that you've relied on in order to provide the subsystems for said delivery vehicle, sure, maybe you've been able to come up with a process that's a bit more hardened and a bit more secure, but you're relying on components that are not reliable and processes that are not reliable. And yet you're talking about nuclear weapons. You're talking about all of these components that make it all work. I think this is one of the, if not the first instance I've seen of that all being woven together in one place in your book. One of the arguments that I would put forward that I hear from folks who are, within Stratcom or the Joint Staff or Global Strike or, more broadly within the DoD ecosystem is we're way more hardened. We're way more resilient. We know what these threats are. Our systems are not that vulnerable. We're not going to do what Uber does. We're not Target, right? We're not going to have some HVAC system that someone can break in via, and all of a sudden they've been able to hack our delivery system's code. But the book begins to paint a picture of how that's not necessarily the case. So I wanted to kind of ask you to talk a little bit about this for those who are listening in here today. What have you seen as you've done the research, and how do these things combine so that what should be really the most hardened and secure systems really may very well not be?
Well, I didn't do the research on that. The GAO did the research on that. And in a 2018 report, which was admittedly a couple of years ago, a few years ago, they found all kinds of problems with embedded control systems and computer systems in real weapon systems. Okay, and you could say, well, they that was then, this is now, and they fixed all of those. Well, I don't believe that. Okay, but they found, for example, they were able to reboot a system in operation. Okay.
Yep.
They rebooted the system. Okay. They were able to see what was on the screens of operators. They were able to insert code that instructed the operator of the guy at the screen to insert 2 quarters before it continued. I mean, they were able to take control over this, partial control, gain initial access in an hour, and take complete control in a day. Okay. And they pointed out that they only identified a small fraction of the vulnerabilities. Why? Because not all systems were looked at. Sometimes they were denied access because the systems were in operation. Sometimes they couldn't get access to code because it was proprietary, and so on. And yet, despite this, people had confidence that they were secure. I have seen this myself. Okay, I was once at a combat exercise, an army exercise, in which the commander of the blue team, I talked to him about it, and they said, we've got the cyber business under control now, and yes, it's they can throw anything they want at us, and so on, and we're dealing with it really well. I'm not creating much of a problem. And so, I left the group and sort of found the guy who was managing their computer systems, and said, what this guy said, is that really true? He looked at me like I was nuts. And he said, no, the reason that we have, I mean, he's correct, and we're able to manage all this stuff, but that's because the red team has one arm tied behind its back. And there are lots of things that it can't do. And it won't let that, because because the exercise was shut down, and the exercise would be over in 15 minutes, and it's a 1-week exercise, and we lose the $6 million that we put into planning the exercise. And so no, don't believe this guy.
That was a striking anecdote that you had in the book there, describing how they wouldn't even touch it because it would be, it would fail too fast. It would actually destroy everything so quickly. So, General Hyten has publicly said that he, coming into his role at Stratcom, that they struggled with even mapping the entire NC3 system. You note in the book, this number 4,500 different systems that are involved that need to be red teamed. They've really clearly, this is hard. It's hard for, you deal with this every day in the cybersecurity domain, and anybody out there that deals with this stuff doing an inventory of all of your assets and being able to understand what the threat surface actually is almost impossible for large organizations, right? Yeah. Much less with NC3. So is there one thing I wanted to ask you here? Is there a public sector example of that you're aware of that you could even point to that begins to get after that sort of complexity in terms of understanding its threat surface so that they can actually protect themselves? I think of Eric Gross who we've worked very closely with, you know, who the former head of security and privacy at Google, talks about these things, you know, extensively. But when thinking about how to actually get after that system level complexity, what have you seen? What would you point to that could actually be an instance where that could be done?
In government, you mean? Or
Yeah. Well, looking at private sector examples of what maybe they could look to so that they can emulate it.
well, banks do a pretty good job of this, as I understand. They're not perfect either,
Yeah.
but they can at least map out what's on their network much more effectively than most government installations. Is there a government installation that does well? When I've gone through this, I mean, the Department of Energy actually seems pretty good. I mean, I make some comments there about Department of Energy's shortcomings and so on, but they're not. They're minimal compared to the Department of Defense. And DOE is actually pretty good. I see a culture of security around DOE that I don't around DOD. So I don't know what they're actually doing in terms of tracking down systems on their networks and so on, but I know that they take their security culture is very, very strong.
It's going to be, you know, all that much more complicated because of the size and the direction things are headed. You know, to a certain extent, you start talking about JADC2 and the intentions of kind of these modernized networked battle spaces, you know, where they want to take things. One of the things you also point to is the adage that complexity is the enemy of security. Where does this go, right? With all of the different veins of vulnerabilities that you begin to elucidate in the book, you're looking at an ever more networked and ever more complex and ever more vulnerable set of systems that crosses over into the NC3 domain, that crosses over into the nuclear domain. How do you see that playing out? How do you see, you know, the building being able to actually protect itself against the vulnerabilities that might create?
To be honest, I'm scared. The vision of JADC2, which I guess stands for Joint All Domain Command and Control, JADC2.
And if I'm not mistaken, it's now CJADC2, combined joint. Yes.
All right. The idea that you're going to integrate all sensors to all shooters is I mean, it's nice as an aspirational point, but is there actually going to be a system called JADC2, CJADC2? I don't know the answer to that. I sort of hope not. That would really scare me, because if there were a system, then then somebody could attack it, and there would be a lot of hell to pay because of the greater complexity. I mean, the problem that I see in all of this is that we, and JADC2 is a great example of it. We always want our computers to do more, right? We always want greater functionality. So our computers now today are better than they were, in some sense of better. They're more functional than they were 5 years ago.
Sure.
They're all better, okay? But they've also increased they're also much more complicated. They're much more complex. And what happens with the increased complexity is that you get a reduction in security. Every security person will tell you that security and complexity work against each other, that more complex systems are less secure. And that nobody knows how to break that relationship in the long run. And so what happens is that as we demand more functionality, more functions, more speed, more ease of use, and so on, the systems become more and more complicated. You can see this in the amount of software that goes into airplanes, for example.
Yep.
The F-86 had exactly 0 lines of software because it's the Korean War, no computers. Okay. F-85, the F-35 now has 10 million, millions of lines of code, and it's just going up. We want our computer systems to do more, but people do not know how to make the trade-off between the benefits you get for for functionality against the costs that you incur in reduced security. Nobody knows how to do that, and there's no willingness to do that. And I fear that that's what's happening with something like JADC2. This is, a lot more sophisticated, a lot more complex than anything that's ever been done before. And people are going to try to, make it all singing, all dancing system with, all sorts of great functionality. It's going to be more complicated. And there's going to be more cyber risk and more places for the bad guy to get in. So I really worry about that. I don't know how to make people stop that.
Well, one of the things that you start to talk about in the book that I think is something that is a powerful element of what you've put forward here is this notion that the leadership that is in the planning phases that are part of the requirement setting, that are actually part of the acquisition cycle, that they need to moderate their appetite.
Right.
And that perhaps the actual answer, and I've heard senior DoD leaders talk about this, whether in the soft community or even in, at Stratcom, talking about moving away from digital and actually, reverting to analog and coming up with much more simplified solutions. I got to ask you though, have you seen that successful in any other sectors where, leaders have known that they need to moderate their appetite for increased functionality, and actually moved away from that and actually prioritized security instead?
Well, I can give you a personal anecdote, which is that I'm trying to buy a new refrigerator now. I don't want Wi-Fi connectivity on it. And I tell you, it's hard to get a high-end refrigerator without Wi-Fi.
That's incredible.
Right?
Yeah.
And did you know that you can get a toothbrush with Bluetooth on it?
That seems necessary.
Yes, right. Okay. No, thank you. My toothbrush works just fine without Bluetooth. So,
yeah.
And I don't, I will not buy a Bluetooth enabled toothbrush. Okay, I have that choice now. Maybe in 10 years, nobody will give me a toothbrush without it. Who knows, right?
Yeah.
I'm sure I can't get a high-end refrigerator in 10 years without Wi-Fi. I'm sure of that.
So if you're not good, if the powers that be, the ones that need to develop these systems, are ever inclined towards more complexity, and thus we are ever more vulnerable, what other elements of this could you bring to bear? Something I wanted to ask you about, some of our friends over at Galois who are able to use mathematical proofs to actually approach this through a different means. That they've worked with DARPA and election security. They've been able to use those approaches to perhaps harden these. Is that applicable for NC3? Is that applicable for these nuclear systems as well, perhaps?
Well, the whole business about automated proofs, so proofs of correctness, formal proofs of correctness, so on, it's all very good, but they only deal with relatively small bodies of code. Several tens, maybe 100,000 lines of code. So that's the right ballpark. I haven't been following it, but it's not millions of lines. And the other thing is that they do not, I repeat, they do not guarantee you that you have a good program at the end. All they do is they prove that your program conforms to the requirements, to the specifications. That how do you know the specifications are right? You know that you know the expression. No, is that a bug or is that a feature? Program does X. Should it do that? I say yes. You say no. As long as there are those kinds of ambiguities, you'll never. No program verification system will ever deal with that kind of a problem, because we disagree about what the program should be doing under those circumstances.
Yep. Well, so let's take a step back here. I think something maybe we skipped at the outset was, as you go into the different components, right? The weapons themselves, the delivery vehicles, NC3 apparatus through which they're operated. What would you say you were most concerned by in terms of what would, because something that you mentioned multiple times in there is that those who are managing these systems are fairly confident that their risk is low, not just because their systems, most of which remain analog or air gapped, et cetera, but much of which has never really been upgraded or synthesized with these digital technologies. What in this mix of systems that you were looking at really do you think is of the highest likelihood of being targeted, and what presents the greatest risk?
give you an example of something that which is speculative. Okay, and there's no one big overriding risk to me in all of this. It's all a bunch of little things that could be that could be brought to bear. So when you go on alert, you raise DEFCONs and so on. You know, your nuclear force. So you could imagine nuclear forces, people on leave, or people, you know, people would be recalled back to the office. You know, bring back people from leave. Okay. How do they notify you? They probably notify you through a text message on your cell phone, something like that.
Yep.
Well, how do I know that the phone system is secure? The phone system used to distribute those messages is secure. Is there some bad guy listening to that? Do I does this person thereby get advance notice of our bringing forces up to alert? And what do they know with what do they know? What do they make of this information, and how do they use this information? Okay. Is somebody worrying about the secondary system that commercial system perhaps that they're using to bring back people? It's not a classified system, but that's sensitive information.
Yep.
So maybe is there somebody worrying? So those are the kinds of worries that I have. It's stuff that you wouldn't enter. It's not that they're going to find a way of hacking into the nuclear warheads and making them not explode or something like that. I mean, that's much harder to imagine. But it's the little things like I described just now that to me are the most likely places that something bad could happen.
Interesting. Let me one, it's something that you've spent time on, stuff that we've talked about extensively. There's all of these different scenarios. There's, I think, for the US, there's a significant level of resilience, redundancy in those comm systems built in, OPSEC and whatever. There's still vulnerabilities there, I think, not just here based in the United States, but forward bases as well, where movement of various forces. Yeah, there's definitely factors that need to be brought to bear there. Tracking people in their movements, whatnot. What signals does that send? Thinking about the range of things that you cover in the book, where would you assert, then kind of evolve the question a little bit, where would you assert maybe that some of the poorest cybersecurity steps are being taken in this spectrum? I mean, you talked about everything from simulation to delivery vehicles to NC3. Was there an element of this superstructure that you actually found seemingly further behind?
Well, the GAO report clearly says that the weapon systems themselves are very vulnerable, and I certainly believe that. Everything that the GAO found is consistent with what I've learned about DoD weapon systems in the past. Cybersecurity of weapon systems is a second-tier issue. It is not a first-tier issue in terms of the attention and concern that it gets. Let alone the question of somebody arguing that you don't need a certain performance requirement because it originates too much security vulnerability. We never get to that. I mean, that's a more sophisticated concern that they don't address. But even as the basic concern, it's a poor second.
As we take that in, this is one of the things that I really wanted to talk to you about. You think about because as you put it, right, there's a range of lower level, even tactical level vulnerabilities that you've identified here.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean at the system level, right? As you begin to allude to in the book, and I think as anybody who follows these issues is very well aware, credibility and signaling is what underpins all things deterrence.
Right.
And if, as you were just relaying, if it's true to reality, if the systems, the weapon systems themselves are vulnerable, adversaries know that. And it's not even just leaving those systems vulnerable to malware or some sort of manipulation. It's the fact that through cyber espionage, you've gained certain insight into operations and plans. You've got a sense of, like you were just talking about, through information systems, you can see what people are thinking of doing and what they're actually doing. What does all that mean for deterrence then? If at the end of the day, the credibility factor itself has at its core been laid bare and it's vulnerable.
So here is an interesting scenario. Okay, let's imagine a crisis in which an impending invasion of Taiwan or something. Who knows, right? Well, the Chinese demonstrate the ability to demonstrate an ability to conduct some sort of cyber interference with some nuclear command and control element. Okay. So maybe they do something that's not even particularly bad, but it's certainly unauthorized. They cause one of the early warning satellites to drift off course. They prevented. They conducted denial of service attack on the control system so that the guys on the ground can't control the attitude of this system.
Yeah.
And then they call up the U.S. through diplomatic channels and say, you know what just happened? You might not know about it, Mr. You might not know about this, but go check with your people. You'll find that one of your early warning satellites drifted off course, and the operators had a really hard time fixing it. Okay, they were eventually able to do it, but they had a really hard time. And then you say, and we were responsible for that. And here's proof. So if you go into the code and you see, you see some particular signature, here's a 153 digit code number, and this is our code number. You can take a look at it, and here's where you'll find it. And then we find it. Okay. And I say, I just want you to know, we've done this on lots of your systems. Okay. Now, there's an interesting question there. Do you believe them? What do you say? Okay. They've revealed that they have capability against this one system, but did they just blow their wad? Or is it available on 69 out of the other 123 systems that we have, or something like that?
Sure.
What does that do to our confidence? And
or if you're Pakistan, and the Chinese help you figure out that that's what the Indians have done.
Right.
What is that going to lend you to? And so that, one of the reasons why I find this work so absolutely fundamental, what you've done here in painting this more comprehensive picture, is because it all ties back up.
Yep.
Right? There's all these questions about rethinking nuclear deterrence that are going around right now. There's lots of discussion about what the Chinese are doing. There's lots of discussion of, how big is the North Korean arsenal going to be? What are the Pakistanis doing? Will Iran get a bomb? But all of what we've understood in terms of deterrence is based off of this dyadic relationship, primarily based off this dyadic relationship to the United States and Russia. Some other factors coming into that to a lesser degree. But all of that is underpinned off the fact that our signaling is credible.
Right.
That our deterrent is credible.
Right.
And what your work paints is a picture here of an array of different components of the overall system that are not credible on their face, because of their inherent vulnerabilities. And if you want to extrapolate this out a little further, anyone who's building out their systems today is not starting off from that more analog position that the United States may be coming from, right? They're inherently going to be more susceptible to these sorts of attacks simply because their systems are starting off digital, right? So you mentioned cyber vulnerabilities for other nations vis-a-vis their budgets and what they're able to actually build in terms of protecting themselves. If the US can't do this, can't, look at GAO report, extrapolate it out. If we can't protect our own system, imagine just how vulnerable these other systems might be. We see more entanglement, we see more vulnerability, so we see less credibility. Is that about where this lands you?
I won't say certainly, but I'll say quite possibly.
Yeah.
You certainly have to worry about that.
Yeah.
And by the way, the United States would have an interest in being able to penetrate the Pakistani command and control system or whatever to disable their nuclear weapons programs. No, sorry, not programs. Capabilities.
Capabilities, right?
You'd want to be able to, and whether or not we could do that would be held at the highest levels. That's a super black, special access program, some covert operation that only 3 people know about or something.
And so in that world, this picture that you painted, then, it undermines the reliability, the credibility, perhaps, right? Where does that leave us then in terms of these postures? Would you assert have countries lean more toward first use? Are they going to be more inclined towards use because they know they may be at a more significant disadvantage because their systems may be compromised in some way or another?
You can argue. I can make the argument to you, depending either direction, depending on what answer you want. Right? On one hand, it makes you more insecure that your systems work, so you might tend to rely on them less. So that's possible. Okay? On the other hand, if you're suddenly made more insecure, maybe you think that if I wait longer, I'll get even more insecure. I'll lose even more control, and I'm going to use them sooner rather than later. Yeah. So you can make the argument both ways, and I have no way of distinguishing between those two operationally.
So one of the things that we've talked about at IST, right, is in this reality with these vulnerable systems that are increasingly complex, increasingly vulnerable, what are some of the options that are on the table to help create de-escalatory options? We've talked about Catalink, this secure communications capability. You noted in the book, and thanks for that, putting that in there as a potential option. How does that piece play into this sort of this intersectionality?
Well, so some people often ask me, is there anything that we could do cooperatively with the Russians or the Chinese or somebody in this?
Yeah.
And it seems to me that the answer clearly has to be yes. That there is at least one aspect where we have a common interest. That namely, if you get into a war, it's really a good idea to have the leaders be able to talk to both sides, to be able to talk to each other to turn off the war. And especially after the first nuclear weapon goes off. Yeah. You want to be able to talk to the other guy. And, I'm going to say next few minutes are devoted to stuff that you, of course, already know. You know it better than I do because of Catalink and so on, what you're doing. But the general concept is that if you're trying to communicate if you're trying to stay in touch with the other guy, the leadership, the 2 presidents have to be talking to each other, be able to talk to each other, even in a nuclear environment, even after the fiber optic cables have been cut, even after the satellites have been disabled. How are you going to maintain connectivity to the other guy? Okay, and this is an area of great importance. And notice it's not usually considered part of NC3, of nuclear command and control. It should be, but it's not. That is, our NC3 system nuclear command and control system is meant to communicate from our leadership to our forces. It says nothing about communicating our leadership to their leadership. Okay? And that, if you think about it, is a much more complicated problem. For one, we have our systems, they have their systems. How do you get them to interoperate? It just is just at a technical level, okay, without some discussion, without some sort of conversation about that, right? Look how hard it is for us to interoperate here in the United States with incompatible systems, so that's really hard. Okay, now you're talking about a nuclear environment that's cutting various communications channels off and making things disrupting radio communications. That's hard. Okay, You can imagine these guys are flying around in the air because they don't want to be on the ground, be targeted at a ground station. Okay, you can imagine that. But if they're on the move, they're going to be connected. They're going to be using radio. Okay. Does the president really want to be emitting while he's trying to in the middle of a war? Okay, when there could be a homing missile that would come in and destroy the platform for which he's broadcasting. So there are all kinds of problems with this that nobody knows how to solve, and people just take for granted that there'll be some channel that you can talk to the other guy with, and you can't take that for granted.
No.
So
I think
so let me finish. That's the plug for Catalink. Catalink is a specific example that IST is pushing, that that it takes the first steps at trying to address this problem of how you establish a robust communication link that is not going to fail even during a nuclear war, and that's a really tough problem.
It's a wicked tough problem, and it is, I think, incredibly important what you note about how it is often considered disconnected, no pun intended, from this entire conversation of NC3 and nuclear weapons systems. I think the thing that I always point back to is there are multiple callouts, even in the Ash Carter, Steinbrenner's racket, managing nuclear operations text from the 80s.
Right.
There's a whole segment on war termination,
right,
and the literal inability to imagine how it is that we would connect with one another to tell the other person, okay, I'm uncle.
Right. I want to surrender. How am I going to do it? Right. That's right.
There's no way to get that met. You're going to carry your pigeon. Like, what are you going to send somebody on horseback?
Right.
So yeah, it's one of those things that it is not NC2. It's not even really NC3. It is, however, part of the lead up to the moment of and or post-nuclear use. How do you think about that? 9/11 is an instance that you point to in the book. It's one that we've talked about where those comms weren't available.
Right.
I think systems have been built up and are more resilient today than they were then. But everything that you point to in the book in terms of intercepting or manipulating communications capabilities, the cyber vulnerabilities that are inherent to these systems, I think, lends to the necessity for that sort of communications system. So at the core of this text, and maybe we even move to wrap up the conversation here, I think what you've done is you've instigated a conversation.
I hope so.
And so one of the things that I would want to leave the listeners with, but also give you the chance to kind of elucidate, what are the big takeaways that you really want policymakers, those in kind of the nuclear enterprise, what do you want to leave them with? What are the key things that they really need to be thinking about at this point when it comes to the cyber threat?
First, there is a difference between getting the aspirational statements right and getting the people on the ground to actually do stuff properly. Okay. So there's always a door that you see that says, do not prop open this door, and it's propped open with a brick. Okay. The statement on the door comes down from the top. The brick comes from the people at the bottom. Yep. And you got to get those, you got to get those incentives aligned so that people are actually doing the cybersecurity. That's the first thing. That should be trivial to say. I shouldn't have to say it, but it's necessary to say. Okay? The second thing is that cyber brings all kinds of ambiguities to worry about that you didn't have to worry about before. And now there's a threat of misunderstanding and misinterpretation. For example, the difference between cyber attack and cyber attacking a system and spying on it is not clear when the other guy first sees you in the system. You may be up to an attack, you may be up to spying, and he doesn't know. And so you have to assume that the other guy will make the worst case assumption. We may be doing it for the best of reasons, most honorable of reasons, and we know that because we're the good guys. But for them to believe that we're the good guys and we have honorable reasons, no, we can't do that. That doesn't make any sense at all. And so that's really tough problem. And so there are many ambiguities that cyber brings to the fore that you have to worry about that you didn't have to worry about before. So I guess there the lesson is try to minimize, be cognizant of the ambiguities between nuclear and non-nuclear operations, stuff that affects nuclear and non-nuclear operations when you're operating in cyberspace, and understand that the other guy is going to, may well misinterpret what you do. Manage that escalation risk. The third thing is moderate your appetite. Don't try to do everything, and make sure that you can do the simple thing and do the simple thing well. I mean, I think that's actually much more important than doing all the fancy stuff. Make sure you can do the simple thing. I have a proposal in there, or an idea that it is worth considering reviving the idea of a minimum essential communications network. Perhaps update it. But the point is that you want to be able to use this thing under emergency circumstances when your JADC2 NC3 fails.
Which it may very well do. Yeah.
And so you can't be left with no alternative from that. You have, and that'll cost that costs more. You bet it'll cost more money. But that's the kind of thing you want to be able to do. And the last thing is really an item for specialists. If anybody out there is in DoD and acquisition and so on, I actually propose in there that Stratcom ought to have the authority to purchase, to pay for NC3 components that are dual purpose. And because right now what happens is that they're in the requirements loop, but then there are all sorts of decisions that get made that aren't related to the requirements, and the acquisition is controlled by the services. And that means the services are going to make those decisions in ways that benefit them, which is their conventional warfighting mission. And they're not going to prioritize stuff for the nuclear stuff, whereas I think that the priorities for the nuclear stuff ought to be the highest priorities. But that's not a view that's widely shared within DoD.
No, it's one of the tougher things for the folks at Stratcom, even with the new enterprise center, right? They have no authorities.
Budget, right?
No, yeah.
Well, right. They have authorities. They can do studies and so on. They can tell you, you should demand this, but they can't control the money. That's right.
Yeah. Hey, one thing that did come in addition to some of the other questions we already talked about that came in just a second ago, this notion of, and I don't know if this is something that came up but I know you've spoken about it very adamantly publicly, even on Capitol Hill, in light of where things are in terms of domestic radicalization and the insider threat. Is that something you didn't speak to that piece? You brought up the insider threat, over and over and over again in the book. Would you want to speak to that at all in terms of maybe how the color of that has changed in recent years?
Well, yes, there is an insider threat, and the issue there is that what people have identified as growing radicalism, right-wing extremism in the military. I note, for the record, that the social media diets of service members are not particularly controlled. Perhaps they are to some extent while they're on duty, but they're not always on duty. And the idea that people in the nuclear weapons establishment on the military side might be influenced by right-wing extremism is a particularly terrifying one to me. That really starts to scare me. And if there were a left-wing extremism threat, I'd be worried about that too. But so there you go.
Yeah, I think it's a piece of the puzzle that you elucidate over and over again in here, in terms of how sometimes it is rather difficult to get in to these systems because the various steps that have been put in place in order to prevent that. But this is exactly the kind of thing that begins to obviate it.
Right. The people are often the weakest link. That's right.
That's right. Having worked on these issues in other parts of the world, that's one of the foremost considerations when building bombs like this in certain parts of the world. All right. Well, kudos on the book. Thank you for doing this. I think it's a huge contribution. It's one that's going to spark a lot of conversation, hopefully a lot of questions, and get people thinking. So, congratulations on getting this out there, and look forward to seeing how it reverberates.
Take care. Thanks so much for having me. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us, sir.